We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Hello and welcome to another Planet Holyrood. I'm Paul Hutcheon, political editor of the Daily Record. I'm joined this week by John Ferguson, who's the editor of the Sunday Mail, and Douglas Dickie of the Scottish Daily Express. So, obviously we focus on the Scottish Parliament, on Holyrood, but I think that it's inevitable we're going to be focusing on events across the Atlantic and the carnage that we saw in America a few days ago. Just the way that President Trump and his deputy, J.D. Vance, treated President Zelensky of Ukraine. Before we talk about it, we're going to have a little clip just to hear what happened last Friday night.
We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influenced.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influenced.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position.
You
don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. You're playing cards.
Mr. President.
You're playing cards.
Serious.
You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once?
A lot of times.
No, in this
even
entire
today.
Meeting, you said thank
even
you.
Today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Please, you think that if you will speak very loudly about the war,
He's not speaking loudly. He's not speaking loudly. Your country is in big trouble.
Can I
Wait a
answer?
minute. No. You've done a lot of talking. Your country is in big trouble.
I know.
You're not winning.
I know.
You're not winning this. You have a damn good chance of coming out okay because of us.
Mr. President, we are staying in our country, staying strong from the very beginning of the war. We've been alone, and we are thankful. I said thanks
you haven't
in
been
this
alone.
cabinet,
you
and not only in this cabinet.
We gave you, through this stupid president, $350 billion. We gave you military equipment, and your men are brave, but they had to use our military.
What about
if you didn't have our military equipment,
if you
didn't have our military equipment, this war would have been over in 2 weeks.
In 3 days, I heard it from Putin. In 3 days. This is something
maybe
new.
Less.
In 2 weeks, of course, yes.
It's going to be a very hard thing to do business like this, I tell you.
Just say thank you.
I said a lot of times thank you to American people.
Except that there are disagreements, and let's go litigate those disagreements rather than trying to fight it out in the American media when you're wrong.
Well, that went well, and then things got worse, remarkably. President Trump then paused aid to Ukraine and then suggested that he might ease sanctions on Russia. So, a thoroughly horrible episode, if you look at it from the perspective of Ukraine and European security. It seems like Trump is throwing his European allies to the wolves in a bid to reset relations with Russia. Off the scale bad.
Yeah, I mean, great TV, not great realistically. Although, Trump's probably sitting there, we've seen today Zelensky's written to Trump, thanking him and doing all the things that Trump seemingly wanted him to do, butter up to him. If there's one way to get around President Trump, it's to, appeal to his ego. We've seen that this week. Macron and Starmer have appealed to his ego, and they have had successful meetings with Trump. Zelensky's a much spikier character, and I think refused to take some of Donald Trump's more outlandish claims and J.D. Vance's more outlandish claims lying down, and I think that's kind of what's led to this confrontation. With Trump, I was saying off air, I think sometimes you've got to kind of disregard about 10% of what he says. He says such outlandish things that I don't even think he means them. The issue now is, 5 years ago when he was president, his outlandish thing was, I'm going to build a wall and make Mexico pay for it. Now it's, I'm going to annex Greenland, I'm going to invade Canada, or I'm going to annex Canada. you know, and they're kind of buttering up to Russia, and it can be difficult to kind of shift through what you know, what you should take as gospel from Trump and what you should completely disregard. But at the end of the day, Trump's, you know, I've said it before, he's a businessman, and I think this is, you know, he approaches politics from a kind of businessman's perspective, and I think he comes in with a ridiculous starting position, aware that he's going to need to, you know, maybe drop back down on it, but hoping that he can push, you know, whoever he's negotiating. Everything to Trump's a negotiation, even when he's dealing with his, you know, countries who are supposed to be his allies. And I think that's what leads to incidents like this, because other politicians don't do politics like this. They don't do it like a business deal. Trump, you know, still thinks he's thrashing out property, you know, arrangements and whatnot. It's not a great way to do politics, but it has been effective for him. And I think he'll see that Zelensky letter that he was able to read out to Congress and, you know, talking about his strength of leadership, you know, for Trump. I think he'll see that as a victory.
I mean, NATO's been the cornerstone of our defence policy for decades. Is it an exaggeration to say that appears to be coming to an end? Because to me, the golden thread through all of this, if it is a golden thread, is Trump's contempt for multilateral institutions. He doesn't have any respect for the UN, pulled out of the WHO, doesn't have much time for NATO, doesn't see why the US should be responsible for helping European countries, wants Europe to take care of itself, while, you know, himself, Putin and China can maybe cut deals amongst themselves. He doesn't seem to be a reliable partner for European countries.
No, I think that's exactly correct. And this shouldn't really surprise us. Donald Trump's a narcissist. He's clearly wanted Zelensky to come into the Oval Office and grovel for something, you know, thank Donald Trump for all his support, only for Donald Trump to then tell him, and by the way, we're pulling the rug from under you. Zelensky, to his credit, wasn't willing to accept that. He pushed back, and we had the disgraceful scenes that played out on TV. I do think that behind all of that, you have to look at this and just wonder whether there isn't the potential for a bit of a silver lining in that. As much as there's, you know, there's a little positive that can be said about Donald Trump, if the eventual outcome here is that you do get a peace deal, which, and I think as much as it might be unpalatable, a peace deal that involves potentially Ukraine needing to cede some land, but that there is ultimately an end to the killing in the battlefield and some sort of security guarantee for whatever is left of Ukraine, then that's potentially a good thing. Certainly it's a good thing if people stop getting killed in the battlefield. The problem here seems to be that Donald Trump's position is that he would rather that Ukraine made all the concessions than that Russia made
and also
none.
Not be around the table when the deal is being cut.
Yeah. So this is now. I mean, it does appear when you look at this letter that Trump says he received from Zelensky, almost if the letter is the same as the social media statement that Zelensky made, it reads like something from a man with a gun to his head. And I think you're quite the rumours that I was hearing yesterday was that Donald Trump was ready, literally in his address last night, to say America is leaving NATO. So I think it's definitely not a hyperbole to suggest that NATO is in huge trouble and could potentially be coming to an end. That America's Donald Trump stated many times that it's about putting America first. There was an interesting clip that I think the Express ran where he was asked about the election in Germany, and he completely dismissed the question. I don't care about Germany, I've got my own problems, and that kind of sums up his attitude to international relations in general. He's not particularly into war, but he's not particularly into alliances either. He wants it all to be about America. He wants trade barriers. He wants to bring jobs back to America, and to hell with anyone that disagrees with that or that believes that there's a bigger picture that needs to be taken into account. So
I think it's pretty obscene as well that he expected Zelensky to come to Washington and be grateful, having called him a dictator, earlier in the month, which is completely false. And have you also noticed that he keeps having swipes at Zelensky while never criticising Putin at all?
But this is, I kind of come back to it. You've got to, I know you shouldn't have to, but I think you need to kind of disregard some of the stuff he says because it's just so outlandish, and I don't even think he kind of believes it. Ultimately, Trump thinks that Putin is the key to ending this war, not Zelensky. And I guess in a way, he's correct. I mean, I don't think we should be dealing with Putin, but it's very difficult to see how this war ends without some concession to Putin. I think as well, I'd make a point from an American defence, an American military point of view. Europe is probably no longer the priority. We've got talk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and that's a much more potent problem for America, given America's interest in the Pacific. And I'm wondering if Trump's eager to bring this to an end before he maybe needs to deal with something else in the Pacific. And from Trump's point of view, I can maybe understand why he sees Putin as the key to ending this rather than Zelensky, because ultimately Putin is in charge of one of the world's three superpowers, maybe an outdated kind of term, but one of the the powers in the region, whereas Zelensky's he said that they were alone. They're not alone in terms of support, but in terms of fighting this war, they are alone, and they're not a small country, but they're a small country compared to Russia. So, I don't think he really believes Zelensky's a dictator, but I think he sees the way it's a negotiation. Everything's a negotiation. Everything's a business deal, and he thinks the best way to get Putin on side is to, not butter up to him. I suppose maybe the best way to get Zelensky on side is to rile him up.
I think one of the key to understanding his attitude to this is that like everything, I think when Donald Trump's dealing with a problem, it's all about Donald Trump, and so he literally doesn't care what came before. He will view victory as whatever happens after he became president, rather than considering...
And anything will be a victory. Everything he gets.
But I do think that there is this bigger question. This is where you get into the realms of conspiracy theory. But what does Putin have over Donald Trump? Because he seems like the one guy in the world that he just doesn't want to criticise and actually seems to really quite like. I mean, one explanation could be just that he sees the world as there's three strong men. It's him, Putin, and Xi in China. But it does feel like there's something potentially more sinister to this, because
either he's got something on him, or Trump simply admires Putin, and it might be both.
Yeah, I think that's true.
So caught in the middle of this was Keir Starmer, who had visited Washington before Zelensky. Now, I think that Starmer and the UK are actually in not a good position in this, but a better position than most countries, in the sense that the UK's got a good relationship with the US. It's got a strong relationship with Ukraine. If anyone is able to talk to Trump, talk to Zelensky, just get him to cool it and keep the head, it's Starmer. And that did seem to be his strategy in the aftermath of the Oval Office disaster. He wasn't trying to ramp it up. He wasn't trying to inflame tensions, wasn't trying to do anything stupid. And I do think that the Prime Minister has come out of the last few days looking like a statesman. I think that he, it's a difficult situation for him, but I probably wouldn't fault him for anything he's done.
Well, I think, hindsight's a perfect science. Probably didn't look great, the state visit invitation, when 24 hours later Trump's...
Well, it's maybe a bit of leverage
off.
now.
I mean, I don't think there's any way of going back on that state visit without causing an absolute ruckus.
I don't think a date was put on it. I think it's the principle of a state visit.
I don't think, the word is, I don't think the King was very chuffed that it was handed over so publicly for Trump to open in front of the media. But on the whole, I do agree. I think Starmer is much more at ease in this kind of situation than he is in dealing with domestic politics. I think diplomacy suits his skill set. You know, a real attention to detail, poring over reports, long-term strategic thinking. Whereas when he's got to think short-term, when it comes to winter fuel, farmers' tax or whatever, he's completely all over the shop. I mean, it's been amateur hour. But when you put him in this kind of scenario, I think his experience as, you know, Director of Public Prosecutions is coming into its own. He is statesman-like. He exudes a sense of statesman.
Temperamentally good.
Yeah. Whereas, you know, it's hard to see somebody like Boris, you know, in this situation.
He would have made it 10 times worse.
Exactly. So I think this kind of suits Starmer's skill set. And I think, yeah, it's been a good week for him. In terms of how that's going to play with the British public, does you know, being the middleman between Ukraine and America, is that going to impress people? I don't think so. At the end of the day, Rachel Reeves' budget could undo, you know, spending plans could undo all of that. But yeah, he certainly looked in the last week on much more sure ground in terms of his kind of reputation.
I think time will tell with this. He's trying to ride two horses at the moment, isn't he? He wants to be friends with Zelensky, he wants to be friends with Donald Trump, and you know, you need to remember there's a bit of history between, for example, Elon Musk and Keir Starmer. Like, the American administration could turn on Starmer in a flash and things could start to look very different. I do think that at the root of this, you've got to look at the fundamental question here is, does Putin pose this existential threat to European security? Does he really want to re-establish the USSR and potentially rampage across the rest of Europe? And personally, I'm not sure that that's really very plausible. And in that light, is the public ultimately going to back this idea of ramping up defence spending to 5% or whatever it is in order to counter this, like, possibly, you know, non-existent threat? And I also just wonder, in terms of how statesman-like Starmer has appeared, it does kind of feel like he's been, you know, Donald Trump complained that we're not spending enough in defence. Keir Starmer announces more money for defence. Donald Trump says he's going to have a Department of Doge. You know, Britain are certainly, Starmer starting to talk about Doge. America cancels foreign aid. Britain's cancelling foreign aid. It kind of does feel like there's a bit of copying going on here. And
not good copying either.
Yeah, and it's copying all the wrong things.
I think cutting foreign aid to pay for the defence budget, if you know the kind of moral argument behind it, I think that's been clever from Starmer to do it through that rather than tax rises or cutting something else, because he's already under pressure here.
But it's not going to be enough, is it?
Well,
if you're talking about the kind of increases that they're talking about, that's what Rachel Reeves' 10 billion cuts to.
And putting boots on the ground indefinitely. I mean, boots on the ground sounds like a good headline, but in practice, you put in British soldiers into Ukraine. What is the exit plan? Are they just going to be there forever?
Exactly. That's you know, is the public really going to be on board with this idea when suddenly it's people's sons and daughters that are getting sent into a war zone? You know, this conflict that the British position, as much as I've said, you know, you don't want to side with Trump, but we'll support you for 100 years in this unending war. It doesn't sound like a great option either, does it?
Another Labour PM taking us into an unpopular foreign war.
You'd have thunk it. There is also an SNP angle to this story. There usually is. I think it was the Sunday Mail that first broke the story about the state visit to the UK in relation to Trump. John Swinney gave quite a caveated, hedged statement saying that he didn't think that the visit should go ahead if Trump is essentially not going to be backing Europe and Ukraine. But the SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, was much more gung-ho 48 hours earlier, basically accusing Starmer of being weak on Trump, urged him to get off of his knees. And I thought that Swinney's comments were pointedly more measured and cautious compared to Flynn, and I know for a fact there are very senior people in the SNP who are not happy with Flynn, who think that undermining a UK Prime Minister at a very sensitive time for the UK's national security was not a wise thing to do. Now, that came up at Westminster in the House of Commons. I think it was yesterday. It was the Labour MP Gregor Poynton, and I think we've got a clip on that just now.
The quality of the contributions from right across the House today is on this Parliament and this country rising to meet the moment. That's why it was so disappointing, but perhaps not surprising, the Westminster leader of the SNP chose this weekend to make such juvenile and childish statements. Does he agree with me that the SNP's leader's juvenile post on social media, or his party's fundamentally unserious approach to our nuclear defence and deterrent, shows that SNP cannot be trusted on the serious matter of the nation's defence?
Look, I mean, different people will respond in different ways. Some will take to the keyboard as warriors. I picked up the phone to world leaders to try and resolve the situation.
So that was the Prime Minister describing Stephen Flynn as a keyboard warrior. I think that Stephen Flynn is quite a skilled politician. He's got his strengths, but I just feel like he got the tone badly wrong on that. As I was saying, there are senior people in the SNP who think that it should have been a much more measured approach from him, and he was like a bull in a china shop.
Well, it should have been a more measured approach from Stephen Flynn, and yet I think these senior SNP figures have got a bit of a cheek to all of a sudden get angry at someone deploying a tactic straight from page 1 of the SNP rulebook, which is to pretty much take a contrarian point of view on everything the UK does within reason, to pick up on any weakness of the UK government. Stephen Flynn's probably sitting there scratching his head thinking, I'm just doing what we've been doing for the last 20 years at Westminster. And
although, to be fair, see, if you look at the Ukraine crisis over the last, the SNP have not been particularly critical of the Tory government's response and also Keir Starmer's response. So I think on that particular issue, there has been relative unanimity. Of course, there have been other issues on foreign affairs where they've departed from the consensus. But on Ukraine, I think there's been lockstep.
I was going to say that it's one of the few. Ukraine on the whole, support for Ukraine is probably one thing the SNP have backed the UK government on. But within that, there are different facets and different angles to it. And I think Stephen Flynn's just doing what SNP politicians have done for years. The other side of this, as the MP pointed out, was the issue of national security. We cannot take the SNP seriously while they want to get rid of Trident right now in the current climate. It's just, it's absolutely bonkers. Added to that, the biggest threat to the British state right now is the SNP. The SNP literally want to dismantle the British state. So for them to get their knickers in a twist over British security, for me, seems a bit rich. I mean, to be honest, this whole SNP angle of it kind of confuses me. John Swinney asked on the Sunday show, and I like Martin Geyser, I think he's really good at holding politicians' account on a Sunday, but he asked him about, are we going to see Scottish boots on the ground? What's that question? Why is John Swinney being asked that question? What's it got to do with John Swinney?
Well, okay, it is a reserved issue, granted, but...
Not only is it a reserved issue, but we're talking, when we say Scottish troops, what you mean is Scottish soldiers serving within the British Army.
Yeah.
And so you've then got a headline in the National, which reads, and other papers as well, or other sites, it says, John Swinney says Scottish boots could be on the ground within...
he was expressing an opinion, and there's not a separate Scottish army, but there are Scottish troops as part of the wider British army. I think that's probably what he was referring to. I don't think even John Swinney would try and suggest that we have a separate armed force.
I think it'd be reasonable to want to know what the First Minister of Scotland thought about the prospect
for him to answer the question.
Scottish troops being deployed in.
But Scottish troops are being deployed. English troops are being deployed as well. This all feeds into the SNP's tactic to make people think that we're practically already independent. If you didn't know, you read that, you know, you probably think, oh, there must be some sort of Scottish expeditionary force getting kind of kitted out to head to Ukraine.
I'm relaxed. I'm relaxed about the question. I'm relaxed about the answer.
I think it was interesting in terms of the Flynn and Swinney's approaches to this. I sense it kind of get more to do with their respective jobs than anything else. Flynn's leads the Westminster group of the SNP, his job's to be a sort of attack dog against the government at Westminster, and that's kind of what he's been trying to do. He's gone a little bit overboard with it, whereas Swinney's, you know, his job is to be a bit more of a statesman. And on this, I always feel, I think the SNP's attitude towards this from the beginning, I think there's probably always been a wariness to be too outspoken on these sort of issues involving NATO ever since the Alex Salmond's fateful comments about the Balkans crisis, where he called it a
unforgivable folly.
Yeah, what was it? An act of unpardonable folly and all of this stuff. I think they don't want to go down that road, and you know, Swinney's more or less been agreeing with the UK position. I think that the interesting time is going to come when, in order to continue more or less going along with the UK position in this, Swinney's going to have to accept budget cuts in order to pay for this increased defence spending. So I think at the moment it's quite easy to be, you know, statesman-like and not particularly confrontational in this issue, but I don't think it's going to stay that way for long.
I sense Flynn's a bit bored at Westminster. I think he should maybe lay off the Friday night tweeting as well. There was quite a telling line. If you remember that row a couple of months ago, the botched attempt to move to Holyrood by stitching up a collie. I'm not getting this word for word, but he said something like he wanted a piece of the action by moving to Holyrood. And I do feel like he probably feels like he's in the place that he doesn't want to be in.
Well, he's not getting the airtime now. You have to remember that previously he was the leader of the third biggest party, and so he was getting TV time every week, and that is not happening anymore. It's very difficult for him to stay relevant and stay in the public mind.
And I think for a guy who's, I think, clearly got ambitions of leading the SNP, all of a sudden his star's on the wane. He's went from, you know, regardless of your opinion on him, he was quite a good performer at PMQs. He was able, over the Gaza ceasefire, he was able to lead the kind of news agenda. You know, now he's slumming it with, you know, the likes of the DUP in terms of size and stuff like that. And I think it's a guy who's wanting to get himself noticed again, but is doing it in a really clumsy way.
His tweets read like they were written in anger. I think he'd watched the Oval Office spat and then just went immediately to X or Twitter or whatever that toxic platform is called now, and that's not a good backdrop.
I think it highlights again the fact that John Swinney's actually doing quite a good job at the moment. He's been in the game a long time. He can keep a cool head over these things, and you know, not make gaffes, not make unforced errors, and that what you probably saw here is
totally agree. His experience shows. I mean, John Swinney would not have said unpardonable folly. He would not have taken a show on RT like Salmond did, and he wouldn't have lost the head like Flynn did. So you can make many criticisms of John Swinney, but I think that by and large his judgment's been pretty good on these types of issues. Just one final issue, we weren't going to talk about it, but it's come up today. The SNP Finance Secretary, Shona Robeson, has announced that she won't be standing again. Same for Fiona Hislop. Both are 99ers, and by that I mean they were both first elected in 1999, the first Scottish Parliament elections. They're both SNP Cabinet Secretaries. I think that we're up to now 14 SNP MSPs.
17.
I defer to your greater grasp of this.
If we count John Mason.
That is a big number. I mean, what do you make of it? I mean, it does seem like there's a bit of a stampede out of the SNP group.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the facts really support the idea that they're getting out of there before an absolute routing at the next election, because all the polls would suggest that's not going to happen and they're doing all right. I guess sometimes the boring explanation for these things is correct, and someone like Shona Robson, I think she probably has been a bit out of her depth, if we're honest, in that finance brief, and she's been in there a long time. She'll have built up a pretty good pension and all the rest of it, and maybe she just feels like getting out of there. I guess the other factor here is that even if the SNP do win the next election and go on to form another government, perhaps a lot of people who have been in and about the party for this long maybe feel like the ultimate aim, the cause of independence, isn't going anywhere fast, and they think that it genuinely just their time to step back and let some other people have a shot.
I mean, also, inevitably, a lot of the people who are leaving are associated with either Nicola Sturgeon or Alex Salmond, and it does feel like that Salmond-Sturgeon era is coming to an end in 2026.
Yeah. The only one left really is John Swinney himself. He tried to get
yes,
out and
he
he
was wanting to go,
in.
and then he was reeled back in. Now he's talking about, I think, standing again in 2036.
Sunday Mail exclusive that he's going to do another 5 years after the election. So
I hate to break it to you, but there is no way he is standing to 2036. It's just not happening. I know why he says it, but I think that John Swinney was looking forward to retirement. He got sort of dragged back into it, and it's... I mean,
but he is enjoying himself.
I mean, he's having the time of his life. I mean, you can see it in Holyrood. He looks relaxed, he looks happy. I've never seen him like that. And I remember his first spell in charge, he was thoroughly miserable, and the contrast is remarkable.
I mean, I've got to say, if that's John Swinney enjoying himself, I would really hate to see him miserable, because he is a grey man. But, you know, sometimes grey men are what's needed. The big thing this throws up is, are we going to see a lot of vicious kind of campaigning to replace these, you know, SNP candidates? There's an awful big cohort that were MPs till relatively recently, and I wonder how many of them might be sitting there thinking, oh, I fancy a piece of the action just like Stephen Flynn.
Bitter selections, bring it on, that would be great.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Okay, thanks again to John and to Dougie. You can listen to this episode of Planet Holyrood on Spotify or Apple Music, or watch it on the Daily Record YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok for the latest news and the best bits of the podcast. So thanks again.
We will never turn our back on a single Scot.
We've got to wrestle with those challenges.
This is the same nonsense we have heard time and time again.
This is our country. Let's fix it together.
Really getting